Thank you for the opportunity to put together this AAIDD talk on community living. Everything about services and supports for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is really about community living. Community living's become a complex and evolving construct in our field. What was once about not living in an institution or living in the community now has different meaning and new contexts. We know more, we've learned, we've evolved our thinking. Community living is viewed as people living where and with whom they choose, working in real jobs in the community and earning real wages, being connected to an array of friends and family with whom they have deep personal and intimate relationships, practicing faiths of their choice, growing and developing personally through opportunities for education and lifelong learning, exploring areas of personal interest, experiencing physical and emotional well-being, having membership in community organizations, making choices, taking risks, and determining the course of their own lives. It's also about accepting the responsibilities of citizenship. The desire for community living is virtually the same for all citizens. However, the complexity of community living really comes from the fact that each person lives differently in the community. We all live and participate in different contexts, and we view life through a variety of cultural and linguistic lenses. Community living and participation for people with intellectual disabilities is influenced by many factors. First and foremost, by who they are as a human being and by whom they define as their close family and friends. But it's also influenced by the availability and competence of those individuals who provide services and supports necessary for people to participate in their communities, and by the policies and service delivery systems that pay for and offer those supports. These factors of quality of staff and the policies that drive the availability and type of funding seem to determine life in the community for far too many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The policies and services that have evolved over the past 30 years have resulted in a complex service maze, one that is increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for people and individuals and families to navigate. In fact, many states have or are developing new services called systems navigation. These services are designed to provide all people individuals whose sole purpose it is to help them navigate the complex maze of services and supports that we've created. One of the most significant contributors to the complexity of the service system in the United States is that we have 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 territories. We also have 3,069 counties. Time and again in the studies that we've conducted at the Research and Training Center on Community Living, the single biggest predictor of availability, access, and outcomes of services or interventions is geography. The state, county, and city in which a person lives has a significant influence on the type and quality of services they receive. What do we know about where and with whom people with intellectual and developmental disabilities live? First, we know that the majority of people do not receive Medicaid-funded long-term services and supports. The majority of people live at home with their families and are not even necessarily known by DD agencies. Of the estimated 3.5 million people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the United States, only about 24% of these individuals actually receive services that are organized by state DD systems. Certainly, a portion of these individuals are children who are in special education programs, but even excluding those children in school, still well over half of people with intellectual disabilities in this country are at home with few, if any, services. Secondly, we know that there are just over 1 million people with intellectual disabilities that do receive at least one type of service or support that's funded through a state DD agency. Of these people, roughly 1/3 are getting at least one long-term service, usually case management, but are not served by the dominant Medicaid programs such as home and community-based services. For these individuals, We don't know if they're getting state plan services such as personal care assistance, or even if they're on waiting lists. We do know that while waiting lists have their inherent problems, state DD agencies do report that about 150,000 people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are currently on waiting lists. Since 2001, the majority of people who do get Medicaid-funded long-term services and supports receive those services while living at home with a family member. And for people who do not live at home with families, since the mid-1960s, when well over 220,000 people with intellectual disabilities lived in state institutions, we've seen remarkable progress in people moving out of these institutions. Since 1962, 220 institutions have closed their doors and 14 planned closures in the next few years. This is quite an accomplishment and certainly something for which we should be proud. While there is much to celebrate in these closures, our goal of deinstitutionalization certainly has not been achieved. Today, nearly 27,000 people with intellectual disabilities still live in state institutions. The word institution is one of those words that's changed and morphed in its meaning within the field over time. Today, nearly 250,000 of people with intellectual disabilities live in group settings. Does this mean that they live in the community? The answer to this question is pretty complex. In the 1960s through the 1990s, I think most people in this field would have defined the word institution as a large facility where 50, 100, or more people lived. Today, I think many of us would agree that institution's not just about the size of a place or the number of people who live there. It's about attitude, it's about control, it's about lack of choice, it's about lack of respect, it's about lack of opportunity, it's about lack of relationships, and it's about being in the community but not a part of the community. I believe that many people who live in group homes in the community today do live in institutions. I am hopeful that the new Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services definition of community that requires home and community-based services to support people to be fully included in their communities, provide choice and self-determination about where and with whom they live, and to determine from whom they receive services will actually be enforced. The very fact that this new definition exists is an indication that many of the services we've been calling community-based are really more like institutions where people have limited to no real choice about the big and small decisions in their lives. The type and size of residential supports people with intellectual disabilities receive today varies tremendously based on the state in which a person lives. In some states, nearly everyone who does not live at home with their family lives in a small, more individualized place. Yet in others, nearly no one does. As self-advocates becoming in power have reminded us time and time again, we have a long way to go before our goal of deinstitutionalization is fully realized. Their position on this is extremely clear. We believe that all institutions, both private and public, should be closed. All people, regardless of the severity of their disability, should live in the community with the supports they need. This is such a simple call to action adopted by SABE in 1995, nearly 20 years ago, yet the complexity of the service we have built makes it challenging to realize. We spend a lot of money on services and supports. The total non-school public funding for intellectual disability services and income maintenance in the United States in 2011 was nearly $57 billion. Nearly half of these expenditures were on home and community-based services, also known as the waiver. I think it's important to note that our largest overall investments are being made in the most individualized supports. That's the good news. Yet we still spend the most money per person served on institutional and congregate care services. That's the bad news. Over the last 30 years, we have certainly moved in the right direction. Our services are more flexible, there are increased opportunities for self-direction, and we certainly are spending more resource on keeping people living in the community in the context of their family home. Many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have vibrant, or as Ann and Red Turnbull would say, enviable lives in their communities. But I think we're on the cusp of a 21st century deinstitutionalization movement. Recent actions by the Department of Justice requiring states to offer employment opportunities in the most integrated setting, the new home and community-based services regulations that so clearly define community living, the growing intolerance of the use of aversive and deprivative procedures in schools and long-term services and supports, all of these point to the need for radical change in how we are supporting citizens with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the United States. It's time for new action, new thinking, and embracing the next wave of deinstitutionalization. We must move away from services and supports that are institutions defined by attitude control and being in the community but not of the community. We must move toward community living where people are included, participate, and realize the full potential of their citizenship. This is not going to be easy. It's going to take courage. It will upset many. It will cause debate and discourse, just like the 20th century deinstitutionalization movement did. But if we are truly committed to long-term services and supports infrastructure that supports people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to be included, participating and being full citizens in our communities, we must lead the way to this new movement. Thank you.